This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Painting black armor that looks good and doesn't look like blue or gray armor is a little bit difficult. But after spending the past 2 weeks doing a whole bunch of painting experiments, today I would like to show you 5 different methods for painting black armor, at least one of which I'm hoping will be useful to you. Method number 1. Basic dry brushing and an edge highlight. The most basic starting point for any of these methods is to first prime the model in black and then to place these 2 colors down on our palette. Regular old matte black and then this very dark desaturated turquoise color that the army painter likes to call the darkness, but what many painters might refer to as a sort of dark slate gray. The utility of this color, in my opinion, is that it's not quite a dark blue, it's not quite a dark green, but it does have a lot more vibrancy to it than a normal warm gray would have, making it a great option for highlighting black. In this case, we're going to use it as almost our highest highlight when dry brushing our black armor, but in order to build up to that, we are first going to mix it with some regular black to get our very first dry brushing color. The idea here is to start out with the smallest shifting color and then slowly, subtly increase the brightness. I like to use a very soft, large brush for this with a circular tip. You can use a makeup brush for this, one of those fancy specialty dry brushes, but in this case, I am just using a spare watercolor brush that I got in one of the large packs of cheap watercolor brushes. In order to avoid chalkiness, I've got a damp paper towel next to me that I'm wiping off my brush on before applying paint, and I also have a spare piece of terrain, which is a sort of stand-in for a texture palette that I can both test my dry brush on and use to wipe off excess paint before applying it to my model. You can also see here that even when I do apply the dry brush to my model, on the rounded surfaces I am using a soft twirling technique where I twist the dry brush in my fingers, as well as the occasional sweeping motion when I'm trying to get the paint to catch on a ridge or two. Ideally, if we're doing this correctly, we should see almost no difference with each individual layer of dry brushing, but a sort of accumulated difference over many different layers. Between layers, I like to wipe the brush off on the damp paper towel and then repeat the process. After about 2 layers of this color, we can then mix a bit more slate gray into the mixture, dry brushing on about a 50-50 mix of these 2 colors in 1 or 2 passes, then eventually a 75-25 mix, until eventually we are dry brushing with pure slate gray. Finally, if you want to tempt fate by adding slightly higher highlights with your dry brush, you can mix in a little bit of something like this color, which is a very pale, almost white cyan color, into your slate gray. And again, being very subtle, being very gentle with this, we can then dab or brush this onto the very most raised areas at the top of the model. Adding too much of this brighter color may create a gray or dark blue looking model, so do be careful, but I think a restrained amount can look quite nice. You can see here I'm going a bit too far, maybe adding a bit too much of this pale cyan color into the mix, being a bit rough with the dry brushing and getting a few streaks on the model and a tiny bit of chalkiness, which personally in this specific case on this rough and tumble armored marine I think looks just fine. It looks like scratches or a bit of dust, but do be careful if you do want a cleaner look. And speaking of that cleaner look, if you want a crisp metallic look to the armor, you can also add some edge highlights at this point as well. Taking a smaller brush with a finer tip and using the same colors we already have on our palette to apply a few finer highlights to just the outer edges of things using the side of our brush. How far you want to go with this is really up to you, but in general, the more edge highlights you add and the brighter those edge highlights are, the shinier the armor will look. I find that having these uneven highlights instead of a really uniform edge highlight over everything can really help things look more metallic, like it's actually reflecting light. Of course, at any point, if you feel like you've gone too far with your highlights, you can always thin down some plain black paint and gently glaze it over that area of the model to act as a sort of eraser. And another thing you can always do if the highlights are looking a little bit too bluish to your eye and you want something a little bit more matte black, is to mix in a few edge highlights with a more warm gray color to help counterbalance all the cool light reflections. You can also paint on a few of these circular highlights to any of the domed areas on the model if you're really feeling confident. And if you want my #1 absolute cheat for getting nice looking highlights on black armor without a lot of tedious layering, it's to use a really bright ivory to pick out a tiny edge or spot of light on the armor, and then to glaze on some thin downed slate gray on top of that to blend it down onto the surface. And now, with our basics established, let's talk variants. Let's say maybe you want to go a bit faster, or maybe you want a smoother gradient that doesn't rely on your dry brushing skill. But first, do you know what else doesn't rely on your dry brushing skill? That's right, it's this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website and hosting platform for all of your website needs. Whether you need a blog, a portfolio, an online store, or all of the above like my website over at howlcorp.com, Squarespace has a ton of great options to make all of your dreams come true. And it's extremely easy to put together thanks to all of their wonderfully designed templates, their super intuitive drag and drop fluid engine, no coding or technical knowledge required, and it's got all kinds of other features built in as well. So whether you're into SEO and analytics, or offering memberships or services, Squarespace has got you covered. So if you need a website, why not check out squarespace.com today for a free trial? And then when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Dana Howl for 10% off your very first purchase of a website or domain. And now back to our video. So with our basics established, let's say you maybe want to go a little bit faster without relying on dry brushing. I've got 2 ways to do this. #1 is that you can replace the dry brushing steps with a makeup sponge. I've noticed this has become sort of a trending thing recently. It's even made its way over to my personal gaming group, so I thought this might be an interesting thing to try out. To start out, you're going to need some of these teardrop-shaped makeup sponges. They're pretty cheap. If you can even get them at the dollar store like I did. And to start out, we're going to get our sponge nice and wet, squeezing it to remove the excess water, and then dipping it into the same colors we used for our dry brushing method. I started out here with a 50-50 mix of matte black and slate gray, removing any excess paint on our terrain piece, and then gently applying it to the places we want to highlight on our model, using a feather-like touch and making use of the point on the edge of our sponge to get into any hard-to-reach areas. Next, I followed up on this with a second coat of about 75% slate gray and 25% matte black, slowly and gently building up the layers of the highlights just like with our dry brushing method, and then finally capping things off with a highlight of pure slate gray on just the most raised areas on the top of the armor. Unfortunately, after doing all this, I found the armor was looking a little too dark blue versus the intended look of black armor, so I decided to mix in a little bit more of a neutral gray into the highlight tones and sponged this over our highest highlights in an attempt to neutralize the blue. Unfortunately, these highlights just made things worse in my opinion, so I tried a coat of just the base neutral gray after this, followed up by a very selective coat of a slightly brighter gray on just the outermost edges that I thought would catch the light. And while the final result I think is pretty cool looking, I had 2 issues with it. #1, this armor definitely looked like a cool gray, not a black, and #2, the sponge texture was a bit too prominent for the result I was looking for. So to help steer this back towards being black ceramide armor, I thinned down some matte black acrylic and glazed this over any areas that I wanted either to be a little bit darker or a little bit less sponge textured. This worked quite well, I think, and after applying some edge highlights with some more neutral gray tones, I have to say, while this result isn't perfect, it was at least twice as fast as the dry brushing method, and it does allow for some more gradual gradients and highlighting that are more difficult to accomplish with the dry brush. Maybe the biggest downside of this method is that leftover spongy texture, although I can imagine a lot of scenarios where this texture would be a bonus, not a bad thing. With a little bit of extra gray highlighting, I think this model would make a great Carcharodon, for example. But of course, if you are looking for the smoothest of blends in the shortest amount of time, I think there is really only one tool for the job. And that is, of course, method number 3, the airbrush. For this method, I started out once again with a black prime and then sprayed our model with a thinned down slate gray directly from above. And then, mixing a little bit of pale cyan into the slate gray, I gave the model a more directed highlight on just a few of the areas that I thought would catch the most light. Finally, to tone things back down and to help reinforce the shadows, I sprayed the entire model from below with this color, Turnbull Turquoise, which is a sort of speed paint version of slate gray. Once again, I applied the same edge highlights to the model, focusing once more on the neutral grays instead of the blues and cyans to help counteract some of those more deep blue tones. And overall, this result was definitely the fastest so far, and it might be my favorite looking of all of our results so far, despite the fact that it's perhaps the most blue-gray looking one as well. I just really like how smooth the highlights look and how much it pops on the tabletop. Method number 4, airbrush underpainting. The other way we can do this with an airbrush is we can take the opposite approach, as I often like to do with all kinds of colors through my airbrush, first priming it in black, then giving the model an overspray with titanium white from above, as well as highlighting any specific areas in titanium white with the airbrush. And then we can shoot a thinned down transparent slate gray equivalent up onto the model from below to establish our shadows. Then to finish up our gradient, we can give the model a light spray from all over using this same slate gray color until things look as dark as we want them to. Once again, we can then finish up with our traditional edge highlights, and overall, I think this approach might look a little too blue-gray for my liking, but after adding some additional layers of thinned down black by hand back into the shadows, I think it does look quite interesting. It is definitely quite vibrant on the tabletop, I would say. Method number 5, underpainting and glazing. Of course, if you don't have an airbrush, or your model just has a lot of different colors going on aside from the black armor, like this kit-bashed version of High Interrogator Saffron, you can always start out with a basic zenithal and then glaze on successive layers of black shadows on by hand, like I'm doing here. Of course, this isn't quite a basic zenithal. I admit I've done a little bit of an ivory or a quote-unquote Deathwing zenithal here, as I've showed off before in my previous Dark Angels painting video. I just did this to save me some time painting all of the cream-colored robes on our High Interrogator, but the same basic premise applies here. And continuing on with this experiment, I glazed on successive coats of our transparent slate gray color, this time just focusing on the areas that would be in shadow, and leaving the lighter areas with just that first single coat. To finish things off, I once again did the same edge highlighting steps as in our first example. And then, as I mentioned before, I finished things off by adding a coat of matte varnish over all of the armor plates, just to nullify a little bit of that speed paint look. Oh, and that's it. Those are all 5 of my examples of how to paint black armor. And I hope one of these was useful to you. You can see I'm mostly using these to paint variations for my Dark Angels army. We've got my Captain of the Risen that I painted using a mixture of all of these techniques. We've got our High Interrogator Saffron, which was kit bashed for me by my friend Sarah Clancy. Thank you so much, Sarah. And of course, we've got a few other random guys, which I had left over from the Leviathan box and are always useful to use as test models. As always, thank you so much to all of our wonderful, generous patrons and channel members for supporting the channel. I really appreciate you a lot. Make sure to let me know down in the comments which of these methods you liked best, and if you try any of them out, let me know which ones you enjoyed the most. And with that, I will see you in the next video.